All right. Thank you, everybody. My second time speaking at Quantum Village, so good to be back. Did anyone see me last time that's in this group? I don't know. Oh, well, okay. I'll look at that. All right, cool. So I didn't talk about this last time, so it's fine. So I've been coming to Defcon for a long time. My first time here was when we were all worrying about Y2K. So yeah, it's kind of fun to now be worrying about Y2Q. And that's why we're going to be covering this topic a bit. So I just want to do a quick level set. Cryptography is pretty intense, right, mathematically. So I'm going to apologize right now to cryptographers because I'm going to simplify stuff here. And I'm going to apologize to people who don't like cryptography because there's going to be math. So visualize somewhere in between those two, and that's where this talk's going to ride. So hopefully there's a lot of folks in the sweet spot here, and that's what you can expect, basically. I'll be showing equations, formulas, but I'll be minimizing coefficients, things like that. Alrighty. So I'm the director of quantum computing at Protiviti. So basically, I spend half my time helping customers work on problems with quantum computers, use cases, that kind of thing. And the other half of my time helping companies prepare for the threat to post-quantum cryptography. And that's sort of what we'll be diving into today. Just so you know, there's not really anything quantum about post-quantum cryptography. There's like misnomers out there. A pretty famous physicist wrote a book last year about quantum. I'm not going to say any more than that, but in it he actually says that quantum computers fight quantum computers, and that's how post-quantum cryptography works. And like, wow, that's just not at all true. So just throw that out there so we're all level set. So quick plug for my podcast, The Post-Quantum World, and there's actually a reason I'm plugging this today too. I recently had on Dustin Moody, a mathematician from NIST. That episode hasn't aired yet, but we learned some interesting tidbits. For example, he confirmed that the standards for post-quantum cryptography are ready. They're all buttoned up. They're just going up the signature chain in the government. Anytime you do something major like that, of course, there's bound to be some signatures required. Just have something here. It's okay. All right, cool. And so the standard for post-quantum cryptography that they're working on is to help the world with this problem. We're not going to go into what the problem is. You've all heard that quantum computers threaten RSA. That's great. But NIST is doing important work in this space, and that's going to be sort of the cornerstone. Now, so there's a great Family Guy cutaway where he says this is the best time since the emperor figured out his pattern of speaking. And then you hear the emperor goes something, something, something dark side, something, something, something complete. So if I were to ask you how RSA works and you don't know anything about cryptography, you could probably fake your way through it. You could say something, 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 multiplying two large primes, something, 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 hard to factor them after. And that's basically the idea, right? That's it in a nutshell. Now, be honest, if I were to ask you to simplify post-quantum cryptography like that with any flavor of your choosing, could you come up with something like that? I mean, most people probably couldn't. They'd probably say something we'll be spending trillions of dollars on soon. But it's a black box, right? Like, most people don't really know what we're about to implement. So this is kind of an issue, It's something to consider. So there are many types of PQC. We're going to, rather than go into all of them, which, I mean, really isn't enough time the whole day to do that, we're going to dive into lattice-based today as one example. But there's these other types. So isogeny-based, just in a nutshell, it's elliptic curve is vulnerable to quantum computing. But if you use isogeny-based, you're working with isogenies, basically multiple points related to the curves. So that's, for the time being, still safe. Hash-based signatures, you've probably encountered hashing before, so no real need to dive into it. But basically, you take random strings for values to sign, you hash them, you publish them, and then you reveal a secret, and then you're able to confirm that secret hasn't changed. It's really simple. Multivariate cryptography, the multivariate means we have different types of variables. So in a nutshell, so you're used to seeing like x squared plus x plus 1. Multivariate is x squared plus y squared plus z squared, and so on. And then that's really, really complicated math that you end up doing there. Code-based cryptography is interesting. Basically what we're doing is the secret key becomes error-correcting code. And then you publish kind of like gibberish, and then you do complicated math with the error correcting code to reverse what the actual information is. So that can get compute intensive, but it's one way to go. And of course, lattice-based cryptography, which we're going to do a whole lot on. So, the NIST standards, like I said, was revealed that they are definitely buttoned up and ready to go. They're coming any day. And when people think about post-quantum cryptography, they usually think about a chem, right? You're thinking about encapsulating a key and sending it. That's really what you're thinking about. But there's also digital signatures involved. We're not really going to be diving into digital signatures. We're mostly going to be focusing on this guy right here. But just keep in mind that dilithium is lattice, Sphinx is hash, and Falcon is lattice. The vast majority of folks are going to go with the recommendation from NIST, which is Kyber plus dilithium. So it'll be those two things for key encapsulation and signatures. That's the stuff you're going to see basically all over the place coming up. So that's the reality. Now, once these are published, a whole lot of stuff is going to happen, and it's important to point this out. It's not just going to be like we get the standards and tomorrow everything is automatically post-quantum safe, right? What's going to happen initially is inventories are going to be due in the federal agencies, and everything that happens in a federal agency we expect to happen in the private sector. So inventories are already due, so expect inventories to be due first. And what is that? Well, it's when you figure out what cryptography you have, what's running on servers, what packets are flying across your network, what algorithms you're using inside a code when you're developing it. All that's going to be important and looked at. So that's what's coming down the pike. Within 90 days of these standards coming out, they're going to begin a deprecation process, which is basically the first steps towards saying you're not allowed to use these ciphers anymore. It's unclear how many years it'll be before they enforce that, but once they start enforcing that, whether you believe in a quantum computer being powerful enough to crack cryptography is irrelevant. Because if a cipher is deprecated, we can't use it anymore. We've seen this numerous times before, right? Like if you have a pen test on a network and they find SSL2, well, you're going to get a weak cipher finding and you're going to have to fix it. It's that kind of thing. So the industry is going to slowly have to start migrating whether or not the quantum computers are here or not. So there's just like important stuff to keep in mind. And then within a year of these standards being published, so next summer, most organizations in the federal level are going to have a plan for migrating by 2035 to post-quantum cryptography. Some people think that's way too far away. Some people think that's way too soon. You know, the truth might be somewhere in the middle, but the plan's going to have to be in place. So this is serious stuff that's going to affect literally everybody. When I made that joke before about something we'll spend trillions of dollars on, I wasn't kidding. This is going to be a big deal. And you might think about the fact that it's NIST, it's national, it's the US, but cryptography is a global problem, and it's not a federal problem, it's a private sector problem. But at the end of the day, so goes the US, so goes the world in some ways. If you're in the private sector, you are going to have to match what the government's doing if you want to do business with them, right? So the private sector is going to follow it. And as far as globally, same thing. You're going to want to be able to do business with the US. So while there might be other standards in the future in other countries, it doesn't matter. They're still going to have to follow this. And one final point on that, this is not the end. Once this comes out, it's not like, cool, we solved post-quantum cryptography. There's going to be future rounds. So on this side, you're going to see more chems start to appear. So it's exciting stuff. Some of the stuff that I talked about before, you're going to start seeing other versions of post-quantum cryptography, and those will be extra options you have to build a more robust zoo of ciphers, if you will. So that's just a little like peeking into the future. I don't know what's happening. Sorry about that. Okay, cool. So, lattice basics. What's a lattice? So lattice is a repeating pattern of dots, okay? And it could be in 2 or more dimensions. So this is in 2 dimensions. Just imagine little dots on a piece of paper. You kind of get the idea. But these are not really random. There is a way to generate these. Now, if I asked you to imagine this in 3 dimensions, could you do it? It's pretty easy, right? You just imagine a box, glass, with like marbles floating in space. So that would be a 3-dimensional lattice. So that's sort of the very basics of what a lattice looks like. However, what if I were to ask you to imagine 4 dimensions? That's a little trippier. Notice I didn't say trickier, I said trippier. So, has anyone here seen Interstellar? There's a great scene in there where he enters a tesseract, and a tesseract is a representation of 4 dimensions. Would you want to have to try and imagine that when you're solving a math problem? It kind of makes your head hurt, and there's another representation of a tesseract. But luckily, it doesn't matter, because we don't need to be able to visualize dimensions and lattices. You can have as many as you want. You can do hundreds, thousands. It really doesn't matter, because in the end, it's just adding more polynomials into matrices and vectors, as we'll see. So the math still works, even if we can't visualize it. So that's kind of cool. You know, you can go into dimensions that the human brain can't wrap itself around and still actually do some pretty important math. But Crystal's Kyber has what's called level 5. So there's 3 levels and they skip. So it's level 1, 3, and 5. The highest security level is 5, and that uses 4 dimensions. So anytime you see a matrix or a vector, it's going to have 4 dimensions to it. And that's basically the setup and the dimensionality. But back to 2 dimensions for a second. When I said these aren't random, right? So how do we generate these points? We don't just like throw little imaginary balls and see where they land. No, there's a very, very definite pattern here. So to create them, we can imagine a grid. In this case, we're dealing with 2 dimensions, so we have X and Y axis, right? And I shifted it so we could focus on what we'll call the positive quadrant, right? Because X and Y are both positive, but you could see that it goes off here and here, but it's unimportant. We don't want to deal with those negative numbers. So this is what a general grid would look like that we've created. Now, how are we getting these points, though? Because you can see it's a definite set repeating pattern. To generate those points, you need something called basis vectors, okay? So over here you see there's 2 basis vectors, right? So you could count over 1, 2 on X, and it goes up, right? And then you can count 1 over on X, and it goes up 3. And then those are 2 basis vectors. Just knowing these 2, you can create the whole lattice. You know, you can just repeat, repeat, repeat. And I don't know what just happened. Sorry about that. Get it right, we're running again. Okay. Okay. All right. So we were talking about these basis vectors and how you can get them to repeat. Now, like I said, you can multiply and you'll end up with the same idea. That would be called a good basis vector. There's unfortunately also something called a bad basis vector. You can make this exact same lattice with 2 different ones that begin from the origin point, okay? And why is this important? Because the bad basis vectors will not take you to the right point if you're trying to calculate on this grid. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. So you do need to know the correct basis vectors to describe a lattice. That is a critical part of lattice-based cryptography. It's one of the pieces you have to have. So we'll look at what that looks like real quickly. So we know the good basis vectors, right? And if I were to ask you to multiply some of them, you can get anywhere on there just by doing that, right? So you could see, starting from 0, we could do 2 of these guys and end up here, and then we could do 1 of these and end up there. So that's how that math shakes out. Now, if I were to give you the bad basis vectors and you were to do the same exact thing, you would end up in a completely different place, okay? So that's important to note. The place you end up would be the wrong vector. So we need the correct description of the lattice, which is a matrix, okay? So those points mapped out, that would be the matrix. And then this is a vector. So that's pretty much all you need to know about how these things are generated, and that you need to end up at the right place. So when you end up at this point here, it's not really a point, it's actually a vector because it's from here to here. So that would be the vector that you're measuring. So that's really how we can get to very interesting places. Now, this gets to be larger and larger. Imagine the higher dimensions, right? It's a ball floating here, or in dimensions you can't imagine, or it gets to be a pretty big complex space that the math occurs in. And complexity is pretty good, right, for math. That's what we want. It turns out in that complexity of points, there's a very hard problem to solve. So if I were to tell you, I want to find a point, let's say I just put my finger randomly somewhere, and I were to ask you to find the closest vector, that would be CVP, or the closest vector point. Solving that problem is really, really hard, okay? And that's one of the critical aspects of lattice-based cryptography, but more of that in a second. So we don't use numbers in lattice-based cryptography, we use polynomials. Now here's where I'm doing you a great kindness. I'm not going to try and show you how to map the actual polynomials to a grid, because that would get really complicated. So we're just going to simplify and pretend that this point here is the result of multiplying a matrix by a vector, okay? Now this point is this vector, that's the answer. So what we have here are pretty large numbers, and remember, we're trying to replace RSA here, right? We're trying to replace that idea of you have two big numbers and you have a secret and you multiply them, et cetera. So how can we do that, right? We have the matrix describing the lattice, we have a secret vector, and if we multiply it, we get an answer. So if I were to publish the answer plus the description of the lattice, would you be able to reverse the multiplication and get back to the secret? You could, unfortunately. So it'd be really nice if that was all you had to do. That would be so sweet. Talk would be done, and we can all go have lunch, right? But unfortunately, it can be done with inverse matrix and Gaussian elimination. So unfortunately, that's not going to cut it. So we need to do something else to get to that point of having secret numbers. So it turns out we can add an error. And the error will have to be small coefficients for a reason we'll get to later. So what you do is you take the matrix, like we said, describing the lattice. You have your secret value. But instead of ending up here, you're adding a little bit of error. And that error becomes a new point. Now remember before when I talked about the closest vector problem? Someone reversing and trying to find out how to get back from here to here, that's a really, really hard problem to solve, basically impossible when you get into it. So as a result, we can publish A and T, keep our secret, and then there's an error involved, and it's impossible to do that reverse process and get back to S again. So all of a sudden, we have the basis. This is the secret sauce to how we get to the irretrievable big numbers, you know? It shakes out like this. So the numbers I'm using here, they're simplified. You can think of it as baby Kyber, it's been called that. And the idea is we don't want to get into the higher dimensions on here, it's just too much to draw. But I'll explain how the higher dimensions work anyway. So that's really the crux of it. That's how we can get back. Now, because of the errors, we call this module learning with errors. Okay, it's not a surprising name because it's learning with errors. The errors are introduced. And that's an important point here. So let's see. Okay. So far, like I said, we've created Kyber's keys. All right. So we have AS plus E equals T. So A is a matrix, like you might be sick of hearing, that describes the lattice. T is a vector, and that makes up the public key. But to get there, you have to have E, an error vector, and then, of course, S is your secret. So that's really all you have to remember. It almost looks like a weird Egyptian goddess name or something, right? Like, you know, you can blur your eyes a little. It's Astet. I don't know. I don't know a mnemonic device to help you, but that's basically what it is. So it's AS plus E equals T. And that's the basic formula you need to remember for Kyber to work going forward. So how can we use this to actually create a secret, something that we're sharing, some ciphertext? So first thing we have to do is create plain text out of a polynomial. So remember, everything here is polynomials. So we'll pick a letter near and dear to my heart, a capital K. You know, my name is as long as my height, and people don't like to say it, so a lot of people end up calling me K. So great, so we'll use K. So in ASCII binary, it's 1001011. All right? So how do we convert that to a polynomial? Well, it's pretty simple. You just add a bunch of coefficients and you can map it to them. So Kyber actually uses 256 of them, but it's unnecessary to go into anything that big. So we'll do a small baby example here. So your plain text will basically be the 1 in binary to the first, see? So it's 1x to the 6th. Then we have two zeros, right? So it's 0x5, x to the 5th, 0x to the 4th. then another 1 appears, and a 0, then 1 and 1. So you drop all the zeros, right? Because 0 times anything is 0, and you just end up with m equals x to the 6 plus x to the 3rd plus x plus 1. That's my new Twitter handle. It's, well, wait. There's x's. That's my new x handle. See? Okay. So that'll work out just fine. But that's how that works. So right now what we've created is plain text. That's all we've done so far. There's no encryption here. There's nothing irreversible. This is just plain text that we can use in post-quantum cryptography. That's all we've done. So now we need to take that and encrypt it. So for reasons that will become evident in a moment, we need to scale it up, way up. So that it needs to be scaled up to 1665. And the reason is we're dealing with modulo math here. And when you take modulo, you divide what's called a Q value by 2, and you round up to the nearest. So we end up with 1665. And in a little while, you'll see why that's super important and why the coefficients of errors have to be small. So we end up with this kind of bigger value, and that is still not encrypted, right? There's nothing particularly special going on. So what we do is we randomly generate errors with small coefficients. So 2 vectors, R and E1, and then E sub 1, and then polynomially sub 2. And then these are the equations. So our ciphertext becomes this math. So you get U and V. And U is A times R plus E1, and then V equals T times R plus E2 plus your message. So those 2 values become your ciphertext. I know it looks bizarre that you end up with these 2 little values for one thing, but that's just the way it works. And this is basically protected. And once you have that mess, you have to, of course, be able to decrypt it on the other end. So to do that, you end up with a noisy version of it. So remember, we added errors, right, randomly, and there's no way for me to know on the other side what random errors you added. So if I did a V minus SU, I would end up with a noisy version of my message. But knowing some things about AS plus E equals T, I can reverse and end up at this point where I can identify where the errors should be. And here's where modulo math comes in. So you've all dealt with modulo math, you just don't realize it. If you ever look at an analog clock, that's modulo. What's different about that is there's no 0. There's no 0 hour really, you know, drawn on the clock. But that's the basic idea. So because of modulo math, and because we scaled up, errors look really, really tiny in the end. So if you think about these numbers, any variation of the numbers or noise will just be a little bit of jitter on the number wheel. That's it, just a little bit here, a little bit here. And as a result, the code can just like throw those out, and then we can once again get back to 1665, x plus 6, etc. So that's kind of how that works, just to keep it simple. That's why we need to scale it, because without that scaling, it would be really hard to detect what errors were present. And this way we can get back to the clean numbers we need. So you can then scale down again, like we did, add in the 0 values again, and then all of a sudden you've got binary or the capital K. Now, of course, you're never going to send a capital K, you're going to send your actual key. And the key you're sending is part of key encapsulation mechanism. So before we get to how that works, I just wanted to point out some constants and variables. So we said before, there's 256 coefficients, so it's a pretty big number, but manageable for a machine. Q is that value, 3329, where you divide by half, you end up with the 1665, et cetera. And then some other interesting values. K is the most interesting because as the security level of Kyber increases, the dimensions go up. So if you're using the top level of Kyber, like we said, you're dealing with 4 dimensions, hard to visualize, but really it just looks the same. You're just adding more to the matrix and more to the vector, 4 values. That's it. That's the only real difference that machines deal with. Some of this is to generate the distribution of the errors. Remember those errors we talked about that randomly get created each time? That just helps to determine what that should look like. And then the required strength in bits. So you can see that with Kyber level 5, you're mimicking 256 bits of security. So pretty basic stuff. But how does it perform, right? Are we opening up a whole can of worms here? It turns out not really. Keep in mind that machines are getting better all the time, right? Infrastructure is growing, and you know, some of this stuff doesn't even matter because of the speed of computation. But basically, those are the values which would mean nothing to most people. So here's a simple combination of Kyber 512 and RSA 2048. So you could see that in some ways RSA is better, right? Public key size, smaller, ciphertext size, smaller. Okay, so that sounds like a distinct advantage for, transmission. Encapsulation time, higher is better. Encapsulation operations per second, rather. You could see that RSA still wins, it's faster, but then when it comes to decapsulation, holy cow, it's way fast. 100,000 compared to 1,400 is insane. And keygen, 125,000 compared to 30 operations per second. Kyber just blows it out of the water. So in some ways, Kyber, as cryptography has to scale, will scale better. So Kyber will be faster ultimately one day at high levels than anything else would have been. So that's pretty optimistic. And again, as I said, network infrastructure will just keep getting better, so it won't even matter. So we keep talking about all this key encapsulation stuff. So this is a real simple way of thinking about it. Remember, we're only generating a key so then we could do symmetric encryption, right? So everything we're talking about is asymmetric encryption. You hear asymmetric, you hear about data in motion, but it's not like you generate key pairs for every single bit you're sending, right? I'm not doing the handshake to send you A, then B, then C. That would be insane. What we're doing is we're using this technique just to generate the keys to end up with a shared key, and that shared key just lets us use some kind of symmetric cipher underneath. So that's it. That's what RSA does. And it's the same thing here. It's just we're using a post-quantum technique, so nowhere in these steps can you attack by factoring a large number or whatever. So that's really all that's happening. But you got to watch out for this decapsulation step here. This is where things get tricky, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So basically, even though over here we decapsulate to get that shared key for all encryption going forward, there's steps involved here that are a little noisy or leaky, so we'll get to that. So I just want to talk for a second about this concept of side channel attacks. You're at Defcon. I'm sure you've probably heard this concept before, but just in case, we'll just go over the simple basics. Has anyone used a bathroom with this type of door lock? Has anyone gone to one of those? They're pretty funny. They have a unique feature where the buttons that you press more often really start to get weak. Like, you could literally go up to it and just be like, oh, my finger practically went through the door. Oh, this one doesn't even budge. So really quickly, you know which three it is, and let's face it, most of the time it's just top to bottom, those three. That'll be the code, or 4, or whatever. So that's a side channel attack, right? It's finding other information that can help you solve a problem. Because without that side information, you'd never be able to figure out the combination of buttons to press. It could take you forever, So that's the basics of a side channel attack in the real world. Now, you might have heard of noisy processes and things like CPUs generating spikes in power or other kind of things that we can hear. You can literally listen to encryption happening sometimes and figure out what's going on inside of a CPU. So that's a version of side channel. And since around 2016, we've known that it's possible to use machine learning to improve that. So to actually make something of all those spikes and kind of figure out what's happening. So that's kind of side channel attacks in a serious, light nutshell. Now, what does this have to do with Kyber? Well, there was a famous paper, DNG paper, named after the authors' names. And they found that it's possible to do a side channel attack to take advantage of that. Remember how I had a little arrow on the decapsulation step there? Well, what happens in Kyber, unfortunately, right there at that decapsulation stage, it then re-encapsulates to make sure that there was no error in transmission. And in that re-encapsulation process, a few things happen. And it's a noisy process. And depending on how you do it, whether you do it with masking or not, you're going to see power spike differences in generating a 1 or a 0. So if you're listening carefully and you know the noise profile of a device, you can say, oh, look at these little power spikes. So it's probably 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. You can actually sit there with machine learning and reverse what's going on in this kind of power gibberish. So that's pretty scary. To try and protect against some of that, they implemented something called higher order masking. So they took the basic code of Kyber, which didn't contain it, and the KTH Royal Institute, what they did was they wrote their own software, more on that later, but they wrote their own software using higher order masking, which is where you break up a secret into a bunch of pieces. and then you recombine them, and that way during the process, it should in theory be harder for a side channel attack to occur. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It was still leaky, it was still noisy, and they were able to use machine learning to hear what's going on. So how'd they do that? They basically took this chip whisper light board, it's like 250 bucks, and they made a completely mock scenario. This is not production in any way, shape, or form. They didn't listen to someone really transmitting post-quantum cryptography, nothing like that. It's a completely mock scenario. So what they did, they were able to train, with machine learning, 150,000 power traces, and using the same keys to generate ciphertext. Now, there's a problem with that, which we'll get to. In the real world, these keys are used once, generated once, and they're done. So doing 150,000 times with one set of keys, it's kind of an unfair advantage and a completely unrealistic one, but that's what they did. So the neural network was used to start to understand how that process works, and they were able to retrieve with around 87% accuracy what the keys were by finding the spikes in the power. So that was the basic idea. And it led to a big excitement in the field. You know, there were tons of stories being published. Oh my God, Crystal's Kyber is broken. What are we going to do? That was our last hope. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like, we were in serious trouble, you know, like, because this was supposed to be what we pinned our hats on. But in reality, it wasn't as bad as all that. But still useful work. And I'll tell you why. So problems with the attack, like I said, KTH wrote the code. You're at Defcon, and I promise you, you haven't been to a single talk where they announced that they found a 0 day on the code they wrote. I promise you, you're not going to find that talk. That'd be really, really weird, right? I wrote this application, and it sucks, and here's how. Like, they're not going to do that. So you typically don't want to write something and hack it. It's weird. It's weird. And I know that word's being used in you know, politics right now, but it is weird. It's genuinely weird. So there was that little thing. Mitigation. Remember we talked about how you can see the noisiness of the ones and the zeros in the power spike? In reality, the simplest thing to do when you're implementing this is to just have a lot of that math going on at the same time in parallel. So it becomes effectively impossible to determine which spike is associated with which piece, because it's all happening parallel. That's like the real simple way to consider it. But that should be a way going forward. Have a lot of it going on at the same time, and good luck actually determining the pieces. We touched on the key pair reuse. That's just not a thing in the real world. Most applications won't use that. Occasionally there might be something, but that probably has other problems anyway. And then this whole idea of gathering traces. Now keep in mind, when people were panicking about Kyber being broken, they were assuming that like messages sent over the wire were somehow being intercepted and put back together. No, it's nothing like that. We're talking, anyone ever heard the term screwdriver attack? This is very much a screwdriver attack. Not only do you need to get in there, like in there, where this decapsulation process and encapsulation is happening, you need to like be able to gather power traces from the processor. You need to also have an exact replica of that board elsewhere that you did your machine learning training on. And then, of course, all those real world things we talked about, the key pair reuse. So this is very much like POC, just to show how bad things could be if you don't do anything right. And it's useful to know that and keep it in mind when we write the code, but it doesn't actually mean that this attack could ever work. In reality, you know what would be a better screwdriver attack? Attacking memory or something like that, not trying this attack in the real world. Question? You'll have to, I'm sorry, it's just way too loud. Yeah, I sure will, yeah.
So for the model trained on the Kyber attack, is it valid for any key or just that specific key?
Okay, yeah, good point. So for the model trained on the Kyber attack, it would have to be based on that hardware, that key, just so that way you can test it, and then you could apply it with that same hardware in the future. Yeah, in the future. But again, still for all intents and purposes, not practical, you know. So, yeah, any other questions about this? And of course, I'll take questions after, as long as you're kind enough to come right to me. Yeah, sure. Okay. So another paper came out which freaked literally everybody out. So it was April 10th that the paper actually came out, even though you see a different date here. So the paper came out, and it was by Chen and from Tsinghua University in Shanghai, and it was called Quantum Algorithms for Lattice Problems. And in it, he did a multi-step, 37-page, treatise on how using a quantum computer, you should be able to go through all the steps and reverse lattice-based cryptography. Wow, bombshell, mic drop moment. Everyone thought the world was, over. Well, just 8 days later, think about that. 8 days later, a couple of independent researchers found a problem in one of the steps, and they made him aware of it, and he quickly pointed out that there's a bug in the learning with errors part, and that part's actually called, what I've written down the exact section. But anyway, so it's on page 37 that part happens. And they found that learning with errors problem did hold up. So yes, this was a false alarm, but was it? Because everything worked up to that point. So as I'll get to towards the end, it might be that little bits and pieces of this paper, and it'll be there when you grab the slides, you can read it. Little bits and pieces of this paper might apply to some other type of homomorphic encryption, and I'll point that out at the end. So it might not all be wasted, and that's why he left it up just with these annotations. So I just wanted to let you know that so far, there have been no actual successful attacks against Kyber. That bears in mind the concept of hybrid. So for future attacks, we want to think about what's going to happen first, what I like to think of as implementation chaos. So, we've all been through all sorts of disasters, right? When there's a 0 day, it's all hands on deck, heartbleed, people patching servers, 24 hours a day, that kind of thing. I'm not talking about that kind of chaos. I'm just talking about wow, we got to rip up everything and replace it. That's its own distinct kind of problem. So you might hear discussion about quantum threat modeling, if you hang out here. There's a lot of avenues for when things start getting implemented, for things to go wrong, things to be done poorly, for new hardware and software to not be considered. So that's going to be an interesting area where you might not be attacking the actual cipher, the actual math, but you might still be doing a whole lot of damage, which is just as bad. For hybrid solutions, here's another thing to keep in mind. It'd be probably safest. I wish the world would move to hybrid post-quantum cryptography first, and that means you're using traditional, let's say ECDSA or whatever, and then adding Kyber to it. That way, if Kyber somehow has a flaw, at least you're no worse off because you're still being protected by traditional, let's say factoring of primes or whatever. So that would be a really smart way to do it. It's a very minimal impact on performance. How do I know it's a minimal impact on performance? Because there's a lot of production using post-quantum hybrid right now. If you use workloads on AWS, some of them are protected right now by post-quantum hybrid. Apple implemented PQ3, which takes care of the same thing. It's like a hybrid signal. There's other hardware and software experimenting right now. So you're going to see more and more post-quantum hybrid solutions. I think that's great. So I just want to point that out. That will help mitigate some future attacks for sure. Crypto is hard. That's something to point out. As you saw, those almost attacks, code implementation is everything. I can argue up and down how great learning with errors is or closest vector problem or whatever, but if you write some crappy code that reveals to the world a secret, that's a different thing. And we've seen that in the past, right? It's not that the math is wrong, it's just someone coded it poorly. So expect deep code audits of all sorts of production systems to yield potential problems in how they're put into place. New standards are still coming. So right now we talked about lattice a lot because that's the first one, but there's going to be others, and we might get right back to the point where people are finding side channel attacks against them and other sorts of reverses and things like that. So that's hard to predict. The point of why I'm listing this is because there's opportunity here to make a name for yourself, I guess. If you keep a close eye on this space and you're interested, you might be able to actually do some interesting work on things that only 6 people have touched. Once it goes into a beta, no one's even seen it yet, and you could be one of the first. So that's kind of the exciting time for anyone who wants to make a name for themselves. So adaptations of the Chen paper I hinted at earlier. What if it affects something like BGV, homomorphic encryption? There's a possibility it'll do that. We don't know, but just keep that in mind that there might still be some lingering nagging problems out there. And then this last one is another totally crazy situation. What I've been seeing is a bunch of products appearing that what they're doing is they're saying, okay, post-quantum's coming, the standards are coming, but you want to protect really secure stuff now, so let's think outside the box and add other channels of communication, not to be confused with side channel attacks. And this is an idea as old as security. In the early days of phone phreaking, why did that work? Because the communication channel of a phone line where you're talking is also the communication channel of the noises that told an operator you put coins in a phone or something like that. So we've always had that problem of keeping everything together in one communication line. So there have been products that try things like secure cloud communications that are out of band, and then you get that key, and then it's transmitted a certain way, and then you use it elsewhere, that kind of stuff, with some kind of like quantum random number generation, you know, just so you can throw the word quantum extra. So there's things like that to get done. It doesn't really matter in the end, because it's really not going to help there. So I've seen a lot of interesting setups like that, and in theory they might work. But they're a heavy lift. You know, it's not just like updating, you know, ciphers on a web browser and a server. It's not like that. It's a whole software layer that needs to be added in. And as you add complexity, you add the potential for bugs and things like that. So keep an eye on those products that are claiming now that they're post-quantum ready, because they're adding some other stuff that might still need to be kind of heavily vetted. And that would be it. So thank you for your attention. Cool. I finished pretty much right on time. Because I had to reset there, I lost my track of my timer, so I just did this from memory that I was on time. Very nice. It was a really good question. And if it's like really, really good and deep, I'm so easy to spot in the hall. I'm the bald head above all the others. So that'll be me. Yeah. Sure, sure.
I'm not sure it's a good question or not, but error generation. How does it occur? Best practices, ideas, thoughts for it seems that's a critical component.
Okay, the error generation. Yeah. So if you remember, let's see if I can go backwards to what seemed like a innocuous slide. So all these variables here are used to generate what the distribution should be for good errors that are valid for this system. So Kyber has, the reason they have constants and variables is so every application working with it knows certain key things. We know that there's 256, and we know what Q is, and we also know that the errors have to be generated in that way. So that way everyone's in agreement. So there's no like actual secrets like to how to do it. But there are secrets in the form of AS plus C equals T. Yeah, so good question. Yeah, definitely. Without constants and variables, a crypto system will crumble because it's just chaos, just random chaos. Yeah, so yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Konstantinos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, man. Really good, really good.